In June 2024, Kenya's parliament was on fire, not metaphorically. Actual flames climbing the walls of the National Assembly in Nairobi, set by middle-class university graduates protesting a finance bill that would tax bread, diapers, and digital services. At least 22 people died in the streets that day. The president withdrew the bill within 72 hours. That country had been called an African success story for 15 years. GDP up, literacy up, smartphone penetration up. That's not the first time a rising country suddenly broke. And we already know how the story ends. History doesn't repeat, it patterns. This one is called the J-curve. Stable countries don't collapse when they're poor. They collapse when things were getting better and then suddenly stopped. Most people are taught that revolutions happen when people are poorest. Starving peasants, finally pushed too far, rise up against their oppressors. That story is wrong. In 1962, an American sociologist named James C. Davies looked at every major revolution in modern history and found something strange. The poorest, most miserable populations almost never revolted. They endured. The countries that exploded were the ones that had been improving, and then suddenly weren't. Take France. In 1789, the decades before the French Revolution were not a slow descent into misery. They were the opposite. France was the richest, most populous nation in Europe. Voltaire, Rousseau, Diderot, Enlightenment thinking had created a generation that believed reason could redesign society. The bourgeoisie was getting richer. Literacy in Paris had roughly doubled in the 18th century. Reform was in the air. King Louis XVIII himself had backed the American Revolution against Britain. Then came the harvest of 1788. A freak hailstorm in July destroyed grain crops across northern France. By the spring of 1789, a 4-pound loaf of bread in Paris had risen to roughly 14.5 sous, almost an entire day's wage for an unskilled laborer. In normal times, the average worker spent about half his income on bread. By 1789, that share had climbed to 88%. The Estates General convened in May 1789. The Bastille fell on July 14th. Within 4 years, the king was beheaded. The same thing happened 128 years later in Russia. The Romanov Empire from the 1890s through 1914 was industrializing faster than almost any country on Earth. Railroad mileage tripled. Steel output multiplied many times over. A new urban working class, literate, concentrated in cities like Petrograd and Moscow, was reading newspapers, joining unions, and beginning to expect a future that looked European, not medieval. Then World War I happened, roughly 2 million Russian soldiers dead, bread rationing in the capital. In late February 1917, women textile workers in Petrograd marched out of their factories chanting for bread. 8 days later, the Tsar abdicated. 300 years of Romanov rule gone in a week. And it happened again, 94 years after that, in the Arab world. The 2000s in countries like Tunisia, Egypt, and Syria were a period of rising educational attainment. Internet penetration in Tunisia went from under 1% in 2000 to over 30% by 2010. University enrollment surged. Young people had degrees, phones, and access to a global picture of how life elsewhere looked. Then, in 2010, global wheat prices spiked roughly 80% year over year. Drought in Russia, floods in Australia, bread again. On December 17, 2010, a 26-year-old fruit seller named Mohamed Bouazizi, harassed by police in a town most of the world had never heard of, walked to the governor's office, doused himself in paint thinner, and lit a match. Within 13 months, 4 governments had fallen, 3 revolutions, 3 centuries, same shape. So why does the J-curve keep happening? Why is it the rise that kills you, not the fall? The answer lives inside human psychology, and it's almost mathematical. When conditions improve over a sustained period, let's say a generation, 20 to 30 years, people don't just enjoy the improvement, they internalize it. They build a mental model of how the world is supposed to work. The young man growing up in 2005 Tunisia watching satellite TV and getting a university degree doesn't just hope for a middle-class life, he expects it. The expectation becomes the baseline. Think of it like a thermostat. If you've lived your whole life in a house at 65 degrees, 65 feels normal. But if the temperature has been steadily climbing, 68, 70, 72, and you've started planning your life around 72, a sudden drop back to 65 doesn't feel like normal, it feels like crisis. That gap between what people now expect and what they actually receive is the fuel. Davies called it the intolerable gap. Other researchers call it relative deprivation. The label matters less than the mechanism. What matters is that grievance isn't measured against history. It's measured against the future people had already mentally moved into. This is why absolute poverty rarely triggers revolution. A peasant in 1750 France was poorer than a Parisian baker's apprentice in 1789. But the peasant in 1750 expected to be poor. The apprentice in 1789 had spent 15 years expecting things to keep getting better. There's a second force layered on top of the first. Educated populations are more dangerous to regimes than uneducated ones, because education does two things simultaneously. It raises expectations, and it gives people the tools, literacy, networks, organizational skill, to coordinate action when those expectations break. This is why the regimes that fall hardest are often the ones that were modernizing fastest. They built the very class of people who would replace them, and that's where it gets uncomfortable. Look at the dashboard, right now. As of early 2026, global food prices, while down from their 2022 peak, remain elevated above pre-pandemic levels in most low- and middle-income countries. The UN's FAO Food Price Index has been volatile but stubbornly high for 4 straight years. Youth unemployment is the second indicator. Across the European Union, the under-25 rate hovers in the mid-teens as of late 2025. In parts of North Africa and the Middle East, the figure for educated youth, university graduates under 30, is reported above 30% in several countries. In China, the official urban youth unemployment rate became so politically sensitive that the government briefly stopped publishing it in 2023, then resumed under a new methodology. Now stack that against the third indicator, trust in institutions. The 2026 Edelman Trust Barometer, released in January, found that just 32% of people globally believe the next generation will be better off than the current one. In France, the figure is roughly 9%, in Germany 14%, in the United Kingdom 17%. That's the J-curve in survey form. Expectations are bending downward, not from poverty, but from the perceived ceiling on what's still possible. Specific places to watch, based on indicators rather than predictions. Kenya, where the June 2024 finance bill protests were led by Gen Z graduates with degrees and no jobs. Bangladesh, where Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina fled the country on August 5, 2024, after student-led protests over civil service hiring quotas turned into a full uprising. A UN investigation later estimated up to 1,400 dead. Sri Lanka, which already had its J-curve event in 2022 when its president fled by boat, and which remains economically fragile. Argentina, where President Javier Milei's reforms have produced both falling inflation and rising poverty depending on which month you measure. Iran, where the educated young population's expectations have been diverging from regime reality for over a decade. France itself, yes, again, where pension reform protests, farmer blockades and political fragmentation suggest the gap between expected and delivered keeps widening. None of these are predictions. The J-curve doesn't tell you when, It tells you where the pressure is. The pattern doesn't care about ideology. It hit a monarchy in 1789, an autocracy in 1917, and Arab republics in 2011. It's a structural feature of the species, not the system. Can the J-curve be broken? History gives a narrow answer. Yes, but rarely, and only with deliberate intervention before the gap becomes intolerable. Britain in 1848 is the case students are taught. Across Europe that year, more than a dozen countries had revolutions or attempted revolutions. Britain didn't. The reason wasn't that British conditions were better. They weren't. The reason was the Reform Act of 1832, which expanded the political voice of the rising middle class before the gap calcified into rage. Elite concessions, made early, diffused the curve. Bismarck did something similar in 1880s Germany, inventing modern social insurance specifically to drain support from socialist movements. Not generosity, strategy. The pattern in the cases that worked: targeted transfers when food prices spike, real political voice for the educated class that's about to find itself jobless, and elite willingness to give up something: taxes, privileges, monopolies, before the street demands all of it. The pattern in the cases that failed: leaders who waited, blamed foreigners, arrested protesters, or doubled down. Louis XVI dismissed his reformist finance minister in July 1789. Days later, the Bastille fell. Late intervention doesn't work. By the time the regime sees the threat, the gap has already become identity. Pattern confirmed. Revolutions are not born from despair. They are born from interrupted hope. Now I want your take. Do you think this same pattern is unfolding today? Or is this time truly different? Tell me your perspective in the comments. I'll see you in the next one.